Welcome back to the Manage to Win podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by Habitly.com, the habit engine to make you the best of the best and better than the rest. Well, at least better than you are today. So do you have a habit that's a great habit, a strength? Let's make it stronger. Do you have a habit that's taking you down? You don't manage time well. You maybe start things, don't finish them, whatever it might be. You need better leadership skills. Go to Habitly.com. First 7 days free. You can't go wrong. Today's episode of this podcast is with Melissa Widner. She is the CEO of Lighter Capital. Now, they're a pioneer in revenue-based financing to SaaS companies. And she's got some good tips for you out there if you're looking into the new year or any year of how do I grow my company? How do I get some financing? They have a unique spin on it. And we dive in and also talk about the venture capital market, what's going on. I think you'll find it interesting. Let's dive in. Melissa, you are an expert on bootstrapping, and I'm sure that's going to fill our conversation. I'm curious about bootstrapping. Bootstrapping a new company is one thing, but also it strikes me that a lot of leaders have been running a company for a while. How do you bootstrap a new idea or a new service or whatever it might be and get the funds and manage that as you're growing? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, bootstrapping sounds good if you have revenue to bootstrap, but what do you do in the very early days when you don't have revenue? Lighter Capital has provided over 1,000 rounds of financing to mostly tech companies, and a lot of them have been exclusively bootstrapped. A lot of them have raised VC or go on to raise VC. But oftentimes when they're initially started, it's some founders' money or some friends and family money, or sometimes it's consulting contracts where, we have a lot of cases where companies have started with some other kind of revenue that they've used to start their, technology company.
Yeah. So here I am envisioning what to do. I don't want to talk to family and I don't want to talk to friends, maybe because they've already heard my ideas so many times that they're sick of them or they've funded some that didn't work out. So I'm looking at consulting contracts. That's certainly one way to do it. Maybe, do you have some examples you can give me on how that's worked for people?
Well, yeah, I can give you an example of my company. So I started a software company, 7 Software, to automate procurement for large corporations. And when we started, part of it is we didn't pay ourselves salaries, so that helps. We were able to sell the vision to our early employees and pay them very low salaries and a lot of equity, and that helps. But also, what funded the company initially, other than some very small savings from the founder, the co-founder, and myself, was consulting contracts. So that were semi-related to the product that we were building, but we had consulting contracts with a couple large organizations that provided revenue to fund the company.
Well, that's great. And so let's say I've got an existing business and I want to, I've got an idea for a new service. Mm-hmm. And so what's a typical scenario there that's going to give me the funding to go after that new service? Let's say the rest of the business does not have extra capital spinning off of it, or at least capital I want to use to go gamble on this new service or this product. What have you seen people do out there? What are some examples you have for us?
Well, look, the main activities we've seen people engage in is working for free in the early. It's the sweat equity. I mean, if you think of the primary cost for getting a company going, especially in the last decade, has just been people. You don't have to spend a lot on infrastructure initially to get a company going. So if you've got people who can do that on the side while they're earning income or have a source of income somewhere else, and founders who can tell the story to recruit other people to come and help them build the product until they get some funding or get some customer revenue.
So how's that typically structured with these early employees where they're getting equity, they're getting either low salary or not much salary? How do you typically structure that? Sooner or later you run out of equity and most founders want to retain a majority. So what does that look like?
Well, it really varies, but it depends on, the talent you're bringing in. If you have to bring in a CTO to create the product, that's probably a big chunk of equity. But at some point, you will have to bring in some cash to the company, and that's either from your own savings, from friends and family, angel investors, or customer revenue. And then when you get to a point where you have some revenue, lighter capital comes in and funds companies when they have a minimum of 200,000 ARR, so about 15,000 monthly recurring revenue. But it takes a while to get there. Usually, a company's been around for at least a year before they hit that milestone.
So what does that typically look like if I'm talking about a quote unquote big chunk of equity to a CTO, for instance? Is that 5%? Is that 50%? What is that?
Well, it really varies. If I came to you and you are accomplished CTO with a lot of wins under your belt, and I come to you with an idea and say, I want you to build this, let's start it together. And I'm not coming to you with any money. I'm saying you're going to be in it like I am and work for no equity or no pay until we get this to the next stage. It might even be 50-50. But if I'm coming to you and saying, okay, we've already got this built, we've got it partially built, we've got some customers, we need you to come on board, then maybe it's for a reduced salary and some equity, and it could be a couple points, 5 points, 10 points. It really depends on the experience of the other people you're bringing on board and how much salary they're sacrificing. And also the vision, especially, I think that some of the best people to recruit in the early days are people who have had some wins on the equity side. I remember back in Seven Software, in our early days, we had very little money and we recruited incredible people. They've gone on to do some amazing things. And we recruited them for sometimes a quarter of what they were making where they came from, because they really believed in the vision. And I remember the person we recruited to run our sales. It was our first external salesperson. I had done all the sales before he came on board. He was negotiating for a lower salary. So the what we put out there for him, he said, can I take lower than that and get more equity? He was absolutely focused on the equity. So, when you get somebody who's had that equity hit and has some comfort where they can, their mortgage is paid off, then those are great people to get in the early days of a startup, because they really understand it.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And did I hear you correctly that if you can find people like that who have been successful at being part of fundraising previously, that can be a big help also, because when you're ready to do that, they may have some contacts or history or whatever. I'm reading into it, but am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking back to, I've been in venture now I was in venture for a couple decades before I took the CEO role at Lighter Capital. But, when I think about the early days where we had our introductions to our early investors, we bootstrapped and had angel investors. Our law firm was great. We had a law firm. We were in Silicon Valley. We had a law firm out of Silicon Valley, and they were great with early making introductions to potential investors. Other entrepreneurs, get involved in as many other entrepreneurial organizations as you can. Go to the entrepreneurial meetups. That's, they all have connections to other investors as well.
Yeah. So, what do you see with the capital fundraising as far as opportunities today, when the market has certainly finally cooled off, as it's been hot for kind of way too long? So what's going on today?
We've been in a bull market until recently, since 2009 on the venture front. So we've seen a dramatic pullback in the last 6 to 9 months, especially the last 6 months from venture capitalists. So we're seeing a much bigger demand for our product. We provide non-dilutive funding, which is, the application process for it is 10 minutes if you're a slow typer. So it's much different than going through a VC fundraising process, which can take months or, even a year. So we're seeing a lot more demand there. We're seeing a lot of investors, tell their companies to make sure they have, I've even heard 36 months of runway, but 24 seems to be the standard. Whereas, and really pull back on spending. I mean, these are things that you're hearing. It's probably no news to you, but it's similar to I started my VC career in 2000. And it's similar to what was going on in 2001 when the market was really contracting. But the difference is that today there is more dry powder from venture capital funds than there's been in the history of the world. So they're going to have to either deploy that or return it to their LPs. So there's money out there if your path is to get venture capital and not bootstrap. There's money out there for good companies.
And so talk about your company's model, which it sounds like you've come up with something that's different. How is that different from traditional VC or bank funding or whatever?
So Lighter Capital started in 2010, and we're the pioneer and the leader in this revenue-based financing for SaaS companies. So what we provide funding based on a multiple of your MRR, of your monthly recurring revenue. And we basically provide, it's a loan. It's a loan with a fixed amount to be repaid. So we have two products. Our most popular product is our revenue-based financing. And that's where we provide X. We say, David, here's X. You're going to pay us back Y. You're going to pay us back Y over $3.
Well, just so it's easier for my audience and my tiny brain.
Yeah.
Give me an example. You don't have to mention the company name, but give me some specific numbers.
Yeah. No, I'll give you some specific numbers, and then I'd love to give you some company examples as well. But
okay.
So we'll give you $1. And depending on how long you want the money, people typically want the money for a longer period of time because then their monthly payments are lower and, they have the money to actually grow their business. But let's say we're taking the money for a short time. You might be paying us back like $1.08 in a year, but most companies typically want money for 3 years. And that's our standard term is 3 years. So we'd say, we'll give you $1. We look at your risk, and depending on how risky you are, on average, you'd be paying us back $1.35 in 3 years. So, and you're paying us a percentage of that revenue, of your revenue, until you've paid the $1.35. So you're never paying more than the $1.35. But if you grow really quickly, or you're acquired in 18 months, then we would get paid back faster. So our interests are very much aligned with the companies. But then if you grow slowly or your revenues take a dive, like we saw some of our companies in COVID, their revenues contracted dramatically. We had a lunch delivery company. We had an events ticketing company. Their revenues contracted 90%. But the amount they pay Lighter is a fixed percentage of their monthly cash collected revenues. So they weren't stuck with an onerous debt burden. So it really aligns to, their ability to pay back. And if you think about the cost of capital compared to selling equity, it's a lot less expensive for a growing company than selling equity.
Yeah, and if I'm understanding you correctly, it's similar to factoring, factoring your invoices, but you're factoring your MRR.
And we don't take a secured interest in a receivable like you would with factoring, but it is similar. Mm-hmm. So
and then what's interesting, if I understood you correctly, is you're saying that you're taking a fixed percentage of the revenue. If the revenue drops, then your amount drops. Is that right? And then you're paying out longer type of thing to catch it up.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give an example without mentioning the company name, but we had a company who was doing about $500,000 a month in revenue before COVID hit. And I think their payment was probably about, I think their payment to us was 5%. What we do is we model what when we provide funding, we model what we think their revenue will be over 3 years, and we model to be paid back in 3 years. So we'll look and say, okay, if you pay us 5.5% of your revenue for 3 years, we assume we're going to get paid back in 3 years. But so this company, we'll call it, they were paying us $25,000 a month to pay off their loan. and their revenue contracted to $50,000. So they went from paying us $25,000 a month, paying us $2,500 a month. So the amount they had to pay reduced dramatically. Now, fast forward, COVID, or coming out of COVID, they're booming again. I mean, they were a rocket ship before COVID hit, and then through no fault of their own, their revenues contracted. They're booming again. They were able to, when COVID hit, really streamline their operations and survive. And now they're booming again as the market's back. And if they had a traditional loan with a high, monthly payment, let's say they had to make that $25,000 payment every month, regardless of what was going on with their company and their revenues, they potentially wouldn't have survived. So it's a very our product aligns our interests with our customers.
Yeah, I totally love what you're saying. And then what happens in that?
It's great. I wish I'd thought of it, but I became the CEO a couple of years ago, and I've just, after spending a couple decades in VC and having to say no all the time to these great companies, VCs say no 99 times for every one time they say yes. These are companies that are bootstrapped, growing, great entrepreneurs, but for whatever reason, we weren't going to fund them. This model is, the lighter capital's model just works so well for, a lot of the 99 companies that aren't going to get funded from venture capitalists.
Yeah. No, I think it sounds great. And but just to understand some of the details. So when that in your fictitious or somewhat real example of your monthly payment was $25,000, drops to $2,500, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah.
So what happens with that extra amount? What if when they grow back, they don't grow fast enough where they can catch up on that in the 3-year term? Is it just the term gets stretched out, or is there a balloon payment? How does that work?
There's a balloon payment, but we see that balloon payment coming a long time in advance, right? It's not like you get to month 35 and you go, oh, there's a big balloon payment. You're seeing if the company's performing to plan. And one of the things that we track on a monthly basis, because we're plugged into the company's financials, so we see exactly what's going on with the company, and we'll see that, okay, they're not going to pay it off in 3 years, and they've got a balloon payment that's going to be, they're not going to have the cash to pay it off because we see their cash position, or we see what's happening with their revenue. Sometimes they have a balloon payment, doesn't matter. They've raised $5 million in venture capital. The balloon payment's $100,000, doesn't matter, right? But we see if it's potentially going to be a problem very early. It's not something you would ever see at the last minute, because if you saw it at the last minute, it would have mostly been fine until the last minute. So we would have a conversation early and say, what are you thinking? Do we need to restructure this? Sometimes the company would say, oh, no, my rich uncle. Yeah, we see that's coming. We're just going to get an equity infusion. Or sometimes we say, no, we'll have to restructure it and lengthen it.
Yeah, but you're more of a partnership.
Over $1,000 of financing, we've seen everything, but we've never taken over a company. I mean, we always work with the company.
That's a great statement. I mean, it's like you're a partner instead of a predator. So, do you have a story of like an entrepreneur that maybe you funded who just overcame, whether it's a personal challenge or some huge challenge, and was able, in part because of your funding, able to have a success or turn their life around or whatever it might be?
We have so many stories. The most common story, we have everything from Fishtown Analytics, that's now called DBT Labs. They raised $240,000 from us, got a lot of customer traction, and then went on and raised $5 million from Andreessen, and then $30 million from Sequoia, and then did a $150 million raise, and they're now a unicorn. We have that story. That's probably the rarer story. And we have, but it's one that we like to tell because it's got the big names and it's got the unicorn in there. But the more common story are the companies that have primarily bootstrapped. They're growing a good business. They are probably not going to ever go to VC for a couple reasons. Sometimes they just don't want to give up the control. They know the vision for their company. They don't want somebody else to come in and tell them what the vision should be, or they don't want to give up that control. But almost more often than that, it's because they just don't qualify for VC. funding. They're either not the typical entrepreneur that venture capitalists fund, which is a pretty small sliver of entrepreneurs out there, or their TAM, their total addressable market, just isn't big enough for a venture capital firm to fund. And there's a lot of great companies that and we have a lot of them in our portfolio that have great exits that are never going to be a unicorn. So therefore, they'll never be venture backable. So what we see probably the most often is companies that have bootstrapped or taken a little bit of angel money, and now they're really ready for some growth. And they know if they, develop that next product or enhance their current product, so maybe they need money to hire a couple of their developers, or they really understand their sales model now and they're ready to hire some external salespeople. So they'll take money from us to do that.
Yeah, very interesting. And so for those people who are listening or thinking, their plan is in 2023, they're going to go get VC money. Let's give them a reality check here. What are the main things that trip people up that make them unfundable by VCs? Because you don't read about that as much. You read about all the success stories and go talk to people, and there's a lot of money out there, which you mentioned. There is a lot of money out there.
There's a lot of dry powder.
You still have to qualify.
But even in the last decade, which as we spoke about earlier, we've been in this unprecedented boom time for venture capital. It's still a very small percentage of tech companies that ever receive venture funding. So you have to be going after a very large market, and you have to have a credible story for why you're going to be number one or two in that market. And that's primarily what VCs are looking for. We know that 80% of VC investments fail and that they don't produce a return for the VC. And that works well for a VC's model as long as they get 1 or 2 out of 10 that succeeds and pays for all the rest. And that's what they're going for. So as a VC, as I said, I was a VC for almost a couple decades. You're going for those big wins and you're pushing the companies to grow. You've got to push all of your companies to grow. And because you're hoping to get that 1 or 2 that's going to pay for the fund and make the fund. And a lot of times what that results in is just putting a lot of risk on the company, because that is the model. You have to do that. You've got to push for growth.
Yeah, interesting. So what advice do you have for our entrepreneurs out there going into 2023 in how they can grow their business?
Well, for the last decade, you could have made the assumption that there's venture funding for you if you've got a large TAM, if you've got a credible story, and you're showing traction in your market, that as long as you're doing well, you're going to be able to get funding. So that's not necessarily the case anymore. Although there's a lot of dry powder, we've seen a big pullback in venture funds, and if this is similar to previous downturns, what we'll also see is venture capitalists holding their dry powder to fund their own portfolio companies, because they will not assume that there's money from other VCs to fund the next round. So even with traction, you can't count on there being VC money there. So look at alternative sources of financing, look at being able to fund your company based on revenues. And it's important to, make sure you're alive for when the next boom happens.
Great. And does your company just work in a particular geographical area or globally, or what's your focus?
We provide capital in the US, Canada, and in Australia. We launched in Australia a couple of years ago.
Okay, great. Well, if people want to learn more about what you're doing, Melissa, where do they go?
Lightercapital.com.
That's too easy. Okay.
Easy. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Melissa, thank you very much for being on the show. I think it's very timely for our entrepreneurs moving into 2023, and appreciate all your insights.
Thanks, David.
Thanks for tuning in today. Loved it that you were here. If you like the episode, Melissa, please subscribe, leave us a comment or a rating. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget our sponsor, Habitly. That's where you can learn the habits of highly successful people for pennies. Learn how to be your best. Again, thanks for joining us. Stay tuned. We have more great guests coming. Bye for now.